And I think that Europe and key European leaders have determined that the West, as we have known it for 70 or 80 years, is no more.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined in my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, who is professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, how are you on this rather gloomy afternoon?
It was much nicer in Vermont, which is where I was speaking with you last week. I'm glad to say that our guest this week once gave Rick Atkinson a ride in the back of his Humvee during the first Gulf War. So that's, there's a connection there. But it was great being up in Vermont. It was above all great having an opportunity to talk about that great and good and much misunderstood man, Benedict Arnold. But I digress. Our guest this week is really a close personal friend of both of us, Lieutenant General / Ambassador Douglas Lute, who's had a long and distinguished career of commands in the United States Army, including during the first Gulf War, and then served as the Director of Operations in CENTCOM, and again on the Joint Staff, and then served as Deputy National Security Advisor both to President George W. Bush and then President Barack Obama, focusing above all on Iraq and Afghanistan, where I had the privilege of getting to work with him particularly closely, and it was really the highlight of my government service. But before we wheel Doug out for the benefit of our audience, we probably should do the usual jackassery of the week, although I have a wrinkle, which I will be offering. So maybe over to you first.
Well, my jackassery of the week was watching last week the testimony of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who was unable to answer basic questions about the budget to the oversight committees, including the Senate Appropriations Committee Subcommittee on Defense, which is, you would think, the place where he would really want to make the case for his budget. He couldn't really talk about it very effectively. In front of the House Armed Services Committee, he was asked by Seth Moulton to tell the Congress how many general officers and general and flag officers he had removed. He couldn't remember the number, which is 8, by the way. He wasn't able to answer my representative, Alex Vindman's questions about flashpoints in Central and Eastern Europe. He didn't know about the Suwalki Gap between Poland and Belarus. And he was apparently unaware that the Russians have nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, from which they threaten the rest of Europe. So I don't know about you two gentlemen, but I am, not reassured that the, defense of the United States of America is in great hands in the midst of the largest land war in Europe since 1945, and a pretty big conflict going on in the Middle East right now with both massive ballistic missile salvos and some really striking attacks by Israel against Iran. I mean, I'm not sure, kind of where the defense of the United States stands right now.
So I had a candidate for jackassery of the week, but actually I know you want to turn it into a more serious question for our guest. And instead, I'm going to perhaps unnerve our listeners by doing what I intend to do in the future, just to vary things up so that we don't get, tarred with the impression of being nattering nabobs of negativity. I'm going to occasionally play a trump card, and that will be when I actually think the administration has done something right. And what I would like to do is just briefly read the Truth Social post in his own inimitable style that Donald Trump put out on June 13th. This is about the war in the Middle East. I gave Iran chance. There's a lot of illiteracy in this, but you have to forgive that. I gave Iran chance after chance to make a deal. I told them in the strongest of words to just do it, but no matter how hard they tried, no matter how close they got, they just couldn't get it done. I told them it would be much worse than anything they now anticipated or were told, that the United States makes the best and most lethal equipment anywhere in the world, capitalized by far in caps, and that Israel has a lot of it with much more to come, and they know how to use it, capitalized and, I'm not sure why. Certain Iranian hardliners, misplaced apostrophe, spoke bravely, but they didn't know what was about to happen. They are all dead, capitalized now, and it will only get worse. Not quite sure how. They're all dead. It can get worse, but apparently it can. There's already been great death and destruction, but there's still time to make this slaughter, with the next already planned attacks being even more brutal, come to an end. Iran must make a deal before there is nothing left and save what was once known as the Iranian Empire. I don't know why we're in favor of an Iranian Empire. No matter, no more death, no more destruction, in caps. Just do it before it's too late. God bless you all! Exclamation point. A little bit like saying "Have a nice day" at the end, but
or thank you for your attention to this matter.
But here's the serious point. His reaction to the Israelis doing something, and you and I will have a special session on this, I believe. The Israelis are doing something in the face of what they really believe, and I think correctly so, is existential threat. And the administration did not originally want them to do this, want to pursue negotiations, which I think were going to be a dead end anyway, as all of our negotiations have been anyway. And Trump, instead of listening to the isolationists in his own White House and administration, or listening to some of the congressional Democrats who immediately reverted to hand-wringing and, tell everybody to de-escalate tensions, is using this as leverage, saying, okay, this can get a lot worse. He still wants to cut a deal, and he could easily cut a bad deal. But he had the good sense to take advantage of something he hadn't really wanted and try to turn it into some kind of leverage. So that is today's trump card. There won't be many of them, I promise, or I suspect. But I feel, I now feel intellectually honest.
Yeah, my wife has a coffee cup, Eliot, that says, "I'm silently correcting your grammar." And I think I am gonna have to get you one that says, I'm audibly correcting your grammar." Okay. Well, because it's such a target-rich environment, I could have come up with another. If you're going to yield the stage, I could have come up with another jackassery, which is relevant to what we're going to be talking about with Lieutenant General Lute, which is the sort of misfired tweet that Christopher Landau, the Deputy Secretary of State, sent to Ambassador Whitaker, one of Ambassador Lute's successors at Truman Hall in Brussels as ambassador to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that said, you must not have gotten the memo or heard about our deputies committee meeting. NATO is still a solution in search of a problem, which is a bit unnerving for those of us who think that the NATO alliance still is a core element of U.S. national security. So, there's plenty of jackassery to go around. Not clear whether it was a joke, whether it was intended privately for Whitaker, whether it actually reflects a deputies meeting that was held. There's still a lot we don't know about it, but just another kind of unnerving, element of clownishness on the part of this administration. But that's not really a digression, but why don't we get into it with Ambassador General Lute? I don't know, Doug, how do you want us to address you?
Let's go with Doug.
So we're going to have a NATO summit a little more than a week from now, on the 24th and 25th of this month in The Hague in the Netherlands. It's the first NATO Summit, obviously, since Donald Trump returned to office. There were some very scary summits that were held during his first term, including one in 2018, where John Bolton tells us that he was fairly certain that Trump was going to pull us out of NATO at the summit. That didn't happen. Tell us what you think is going to happen at this summit. What are people going to be talking about, and what are the issues that they're going to have to resolve?
Well, first of all, it's good to be with you guys, albeit virtually, and we have many face-to-face, in-person experiences that take me back over the last couple of decades. So it's good to see you both on the same screen at the same time. So maybe the best way to describe what to expect from this summit is to rewind the tape back to 2016, 17, Trump's first administration. So he takes office on January 20th, 2017. Wholesale change out, obviously, of the national security team and so forth. And, typically a newly inaugurated president makes very efficient use of his time by making one of his first overseas trips to NATO, right? Because in this case, you can see dozens of allies all in one venue. You can do a bunch of bilats very efficiently with minimal travel. And you can sort of make your statement on the international scene. And President Trump did so in the spring of 2017. And we had in 2016, in the last days of the Obama administration, made a plan for that initial visit to NATO by the next president. And of course, most of us in the Obama administration imagined that the newly inaugurated president would come to NATO and she would unveil an artifact. She would unveil an artifact of the 9/11 attack in Washington and New York, because we had gone to the museum in New York and received on permanent loan an artifact of the attack on the Twin Towers. It's actually the I-beam, the distorted I-beam, which is the point of impact on the North Tower. So it's not just a piece of the North Tower, it's where the attack actually initiated by way of kinetic contact. And it is now displayed in the main entranceway to the new NATO headquarters. And we thought, well, the new president will come in the spring of 2017 and unveil this. It's called the Article 5 Memorial. Okay. And because this was on September 12th, 2001, the only invocation in the 76 years of NATO now where Article 5, the Collective Defense Treaty, was actually invoked. Right. And so sure enough, President Trump, as it turns out, somewhat unexpectedly, turns out to be the visiting president and is there for the unveiling of the 9/11 Article 5 memorial. At the appointed time, he takes the podium. The curtain is drawn back. The artifact is revealed to the public. And his speech had obvious and repeated references to Article 5. Which was the whole idea of the event, right? And he never says, however, Article 5. He drifts away from his prepared remarks, and he proceeds to lambast Angela Merkel and other allies who are assembled there for the event for their freeloading with insufficient defense spending and so forth. So if that's a forecast, if that's a preview of what we can expect this time around for Trump, we should expect that anything goes. I think that really in the history of NATO, there's really one sort of essential deliverable for every time that the leaders come together in a summit format. And that is a perception, a display, a demonstration of solidarity and unity that all the allies, whether it's the 16 who finished the Cold War in 1989, 1991, or now the 32 who will assemble in, as Eric said, just a few days, that they all stand together. And that they stand together because the core commitment of the alliance is all for one and one for all, essentially Article 5. It's not clear to me that we'll get such a statement or such a perception of unity, because we have with Donald Trump a president who features, who favors, who pursues unpredictability. right? He wants to be unpredictable. He wants to at times even be disruptive. And so this session in the Netherlands at The Hague in a couple weeks gives him a golden opportunity to do just that. So we'll have to see, Eric, is the shorthand to your question. But what we should expect, if passed as prologue, is unpredictability and disruption.
Doug, it's wonderful to have you with us. You have plenty of European contacts. Is it your impression, no matter how Trump behaves at this summit, that there's really been a fundamental change in attitudes towards the United States as a result of the second Trump term? Or is it a case of people saying, oh, God, this again, we were able to manage it sort of last time, or at least to get through it, we'll get through it again. I have to say, I'm picking up more of the latter vibe, although not entirely. I mean, I think it's mixed. But I'm curious what your contacts and your judgment would suggest.
So I think if you judge the statements coming out of the core allies, the ones who bring the most political, economic, and military heft to the alliance, so the UK, France, and Germany in particular, that there's a sense now that things are essentially different and they will not revert, even post Donald Trump. They will not revert to the good old days when Europe and the United States were not only joined institutionally by way of NATO, but they were aligned culturally, they were aligned in terms of values and so forth. And they together comprised the West, right? And I think that Europe and key European leaders have determined that the West, as we have known it for 70 or 80 years, is no more. And that they are making national decisions and hope to bend NATO towards a new reality, right? And the reality is that in this multipolar world, rather than have one pole, which you might label the West, you now likely will have two. We'll have the United States. Certainly, it will remain a global power. But increasingly, Europe, I think, has come to the reality that they need to do what's required to be a pole, a power center on the global stage in their own right. And that means that they've got to not only build increasing cohesion as a political body centered largely on the European Union, they've got to continue to make progress economically. But they're already a global economic power. The EU is something like 25% of global GDP together. And then what's really lacking is their hard power. And I think we've seen signs in the last couple months where Europe has come to the realization that it has to meld political power, economic power, and its own independent hard power in a way that they have not had to do in the past because of being combined with the US, but now they have to do increasingly on their own. So I think I'm picking up more of the former of the two models, Eliot, that you mentioned.
Isn't that essentially what, Robert Gates wanted and that Americans have wanted for some time? I mean, trust me, I don't approve of the way Trump has done it, but my feeling has always been that the U.S.-European relationship has been, historically, it was always much scratchier than people have painted it. I mean, that 9/11 was absolutely, from the point of view of U.S.-European relations, a high point because it was the Europeans who invoked Article 5. We didn't ask for it. They stepped up, and that was a moving moment. But the truth is, this was probably not tenable in the long run, and it is good that they really feel motivated to develop military power. Now, none of us here like the way that it was done, but isn't this, in the broader scheme of things, a positive development, particularly if, I doubt that we're going to pull out of NATO. So the structure of the alliance remains. Hopefully, the American nuclear guarantee remains and some substantial, some sort of military presence or commitment. Could this ultimately lead to a healthier relationship?
I think it can. Yes. I mean, I think that's the promise of this shift. And of course, this sort of splitting of the West is only one of the dynamics that's underway globally, right? I mean, you see the obvious rise of China as a power center, which is news over the last 10, 15, 20 years, right? And you have essentially the war in Ukraine where Putin is saying, hey, what about us? Russia should be counted among one of the power centers, right? So this is there are multiple dynamics happening all at once. But with regard to our European allies and the US, I think it's a healthy thing for Europe to be more militarily capable. Now, the challenge here will be that it will take them, I don't know, the estimates vary, but I would guess in more than a decade to actually build the kind of hard power that would cause them to effectively rely significantly less on the United States. And that's because the US has certain, especially high-end enablers that just have no European alternatives these days. So this is going to take a while. What we want to be careful of is just because they commit to increased defense spending, we don't assume that they have capabilities, because there'll be a big time lag between increased spending, which we'll probably get the increased spending commitment out of the Hague Summit. But there's a big gap between that and actually having capabilities and things like air-to-air refueling, space capabilities, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, a long-range strike, high-end air defense, and so forth. And these are capabilities that the Europeans are going to have to invest in, and they're going to have to develop over, I would guess, on an aggressive timeline over at least a decade.
And that's going to be a challenge in part because, we've had a lot of vigorous discussion in the United States the last couple of years about the frailty of our defense industrial base and the shrinkage. But if anything, the European defense industrial base is in worse shape than ours is. So it's not just a question, as you say, Doug, of spending the money. There's going to be a lot of capital investment that's got to go into this, and it's going to take a while, as you say, to develop the industrial capability to actually produce, all the capabilities you were just talking about. I'm wondering, when I was talking about Secretary Hegseth beclowning himself, I mean, one of the things he was unable to answer when Senator McConnell, who chairs the Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, asked him about, which was, your budget reconciliation bill has this big chunk of money to raise the defense budget. And then after that, in the budget projections, the defense budget is flat. And we're roughly hovering around 3% of GDP, maybe a little bit north, a little bit south. How sustainable? I understand there's sort of been a shock value of what's happened with Trump and the Russia's war against Ukraine that has woken up Europeans to the requirement to spend more. The president has said he wants them to spend 5% of GDP, and Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General, whose first summit this will be, right, has tried to, knowing how hard that's going to be for a lot of European countries to make it. I mean, the Balts, the Nordics, the Poles probably can get there, but for others, this is going to be very hard. And he's kind of been saying, well, yes, 5%, but 3.5% will be defense spending and 1.5% will be infrastructure. And there's some fairness in that. I mean, as a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, I know that a lot of Finland's, or not to NATO, to Finland, but a lot of Finland's defense expenditures are actually on things like building highways that can be used in extremis as aircraft runways. So there's some fairness in that, but Are you sure that the Trump administration will buy that, as acceptable? And in the long run, can you really expect Europeans to make this kind of commitment to spend on defense when the U.S. is actually not, doing the same? We're at 3%.
Well, I think the Trump administration should welcome the Secretary General's 3.5 plus 1.5 equals 5 approach. Because if it were hard and fast 5% on what is well established as NATO defense spending, right? I mean, this is written down. We know what counts and what doesn't count, right? The U.S. will not make 5%. I mean, it's quite clear. I mean, you cite the data yourself, Eric. So we're kind of getting a buy here by way of the 3.5, which we're depending on the numbers, right? We're at something like 3.3 or something. So we can make 3.5. I think what's interesting about this 1.5%, which goes to things like infrastructure, but potentially, because it's not well defined yet, could include things that are very important, like cybersecurity, right? A lot of the American federal government cybersecurity money is not in the DoD budget. So therefore, today does not count as NATO defense spending. But think about CISA over DHS and so forth, right? But things like mobility projects that you mentioned, improving the ability for NATO to move itself and move troops across national boundaries and so forth, to receive reinforcements from the United States by way of airports and seaports, things like protecting critical infrastructure, which in the past would not have counted as NATO defense spending, could be defined as being included in the 1.5. So to some extent, that 1.5 might become just as important as the 3.5, because when you look into the next, I would say roughly 5 to 10 years, NATO is perhaps most vulnerable in these sort of with these gray zone or hybrid attacks that we already see play out across NATO space, right? This is the dragging of ship anchors across undersea cables and so forth, cyber attacks, misinformation, disinformation campaigns, election interference, and all of that, right?
Sabotage
sabotage, exactly. So if the 1.5 can address some of those hybrid attack vulnerabilities, then I think that's very important. But as I understand it, going into the summit, the definition of what counts is not yet agreed. So I would actually favor this model if it includes addressing vulnerabilities to hybrid attack.
In Poland, for instance, I mean, one of the greatest contributions they could make is improving their highway system, to your point, so that if there is a Russian attack against a frontline state, it's easier for NATO to move forward and reinforce.
Well, you still have the changes of rail gauge,
right,
across some countries on the eastern flank of NATO. And just imagine that. Okay, you've got a convoy of tanks, you've got them uploaded, and they leave Germany, and at some point they got to leave those low bed cars, those transport vehicles, and get transferred onto a different rail gauge. Well, that's just craziness, right? And yet that's some of the infrastructure that exists today along the eastern flank.
Could I shift us a little bit to what do you think some of the intra-European dynamics are? When we were talking a little bit in the green room that, end of the Cold War, there's 16 nations in Europe. Now it's exactly twice as many, 32. You have this situation where Poland, which, was a relatively new member of NATO, all of a sudden has what's arguably, after Turkey, the largest army and possibly the best, with a thriving economy.
Setting aside Ukraine, by the way.
Well, of course, they're not in
right.
Yet, but Ukraine as a kind of potential member or quasi-member is there. A Germany which is incredibly feeble, although now ramping up. France, which always wants to be in the first rank but can't really lead. A Britain, which always wants to lead but can no longer quite be in the first rank either because of their own underspending on defense, which we've talked about before. When you put all those elements together, and set aside Trump for the moment, because I think the problem is that Trump is just this kind of black hole of strategic attention. We all kind of get sucked into it. But there are these other changes, which really don't have that much to do with Trump, which are kind of shaping the geometry of NATO. How do you see that playing out? I mean, do you think so? I'll just give you one example. It was very interesting that now people occasionally talk about the E4, Britain, France, Germany, and Poland in dealing with Ukraine. Do you see other changes? Because I mean, you were really in the belly of the beast as our ambassador to NATO, dealing with the North Atlantic Council, seeing how NATO makes its decisions. Do you see changes coming down the pike? And if so, are they good changes? Are there other changes that people should be thinking about?
Well, Eliot, you're right to point out that at 32, in it for an institution that takes all of its big decisions on the basis of consensus, right? So today, to admit a new member, to commission a new military operation, to agree summit dates, the vote's got to be 32-0. Okay, so you might say, "Wow, at 32, this is pretty big. This is a pretty big political chore to agree at full consensus on every decision." So NATO has always had a bit of a unwritten convention that the Quad, traditionally defined as the U.S., the U.K., France, and Germany, would often begin the consensus building process inside the alliance as a group of four. And then if that's agreed, if those four could agree, the Quad would then sort of become evangelical and go out and bring the rest of them along and divide and conquer the rest of the allies, right? But your point, I think, is on the mark. If you can't count the U.S. as a reliable, predictable member of the core of NATO, which I think is the case today, then who forms the core or the Quad, if you will? And I think Poland rightly features that. First of all, it brings a former Eastern Bloc, former Warsaw Pact member to the front table of the alliance. Certainly, the Poles have voted with their euros in terms of defense spending and military capability, and so I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, the Quad approach, no matter who comprises the Quad, has always been somewhat contested inside the alliance because there's a notion of, well, who's in and who's out and so forth. But the reality is there still has to be a vote of 32-0. This is going to come up in the next 10 days before the summit because they're not yet agreed at 32 on the 5% pledge, no matter how it's defined, 3.5 plus 1.5. That's not yet done. There's at least one prominent holdout in terms of making that good. And if the holdout remains the holdout, there's no announcement. It's got to be consensus. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the sort of reshaping of the Quad. But I think the model that you suggest is probably the most likely and, frankly, the most appropriate.
So basically, variable geometry to
Right.
to get to consensus, which is something the EU has had to wrestle with too. I mean, the EU has figured workarounds, for instance, to Viktor Orban's blocking assistance to Ukraine and things like that.
Exactly.
Doug, I wonder, speaking of Ukraine, I mean, that's really the big issue confronting NATO and confronting European security. How do you think that discussion is going to go? I mean, the Europeans have been worried that Trump will pull the plug. They've been trying, Starmer and Maloney and others have been trying to, kind of coax him, bring him along. Macron, the Poles. He's, obviously had the huge blow up with Zelensky in the Oval Office. He's, kind of gotten over that. They apparently had a pretty good meeting at the Vatican, around the time of the funeral for the late Pope Francis. They they've wanted the Europeans to, kind of organize themselves and have been trying to get Trump to recognize that Putin has no interest in negotiating and that they want to provide some assurance to Ukraine, et cetera, but they need a U.S. backstop. Trump keeps kind of pulling the rug out from under them, and no matter how much pressure they put on him or Lindsey Graham puts on him, he doesn't seem willing to pull the plug on Putin and or pull the trigger on sanctions. Maybe better metaphor. He gave Putin 2 weeks. 2 weeks are up. We pretty well know what the answer is. Kind of, how do you think this discussion at NATO on Ukraine is going to go?
Well, I think it's interesting, and it draws me back to one of Eliot's opening comments about how maybe the Trump administration has been crafty in its reinforcement of diplomacy with Iran, with the stick against Iran, right? This kind of blending of military and diplomatic tools to get to the end state, which of course is not what's happened in Ukraine, right? So it's the polar opposite example of what's happened in Ukraine, where we've sacrificed, we've given up all our leverage, refused to even suggest a stick by way of sanctions and increased military support to Ukraine. And we've seen what happens when you walk down that diplomatic path. The answer is nothing. Okay. So it's interesting that with regard to Iran, you have a very different perspective from the Trump administration on the blending of diplomatic and military tools, which of course they have not applied to Ukraine. I think how the alliance treats what it says about Russia and Ukraine will be perhaps the most divisive thing in the Hague Summit. And the Secretary General has been rather crafty in this regard in terms of the design of the summit. So first, a NATO summit usually produces an agreed communique of 80 to 100 paragraphs, treating everything from climate to Russia to China and so forth, right? No such communique coming out of The Hague. It's a brief kind of opening statement. It will probably prominently feature the 5% spending if they get to that, right? But it's going to be milquetoast compared to the detail of past communiques. So, and why is this? Because they're not sure if they can get agreement from the Trump administration. And the worst thing that could happen would be to launch into the project, the attempt to get a communique, only to fail to get a communique, right? So better not to try than to try and fail. And so one thing the Trump administration's penchant for unpredictability and disruption has assured is a shorter statement coming out of the Hague Summit. Maybe that's all to the good. The other thing is by way of format. This is a compressed format summit. I remember in the two summits I dealt with when Obama was president, you had, I think, 6 sessions, 5 or 6 full multi-hour sessions with the leaders in the chair, dealing with everything from defense investments through, at that time, Afghanistan deserved its own session, Russia deserved its own session, and so forth, right? And you're not going to have that. This is a dinner, and the next morning, one reportedly 3-hour session with the end result ideally being the defense spending pledge. And that's it. So what the Secretary General is trying to do is compress and scale down, reduce the risk of disruption by Donald Trump in this summit. And we'll see if that's successful. I mean, the president's quite adept at this if he wants to disrupt. So I think it'll be a different shape and sort of product. On Russia, there won't be anything to state because the last summit, so the 75th anniversary summit in Washington last summer, was so strong on Russia and so strong on support of Ukraine, although it didn't go all the way towards a path to membership, right? But it was so strong that it's better not to address Russia and Ukraine in this statement because the Trump administration won't agree to anything that strong. And it would look like they're backing away, which of course they are. So it puts NATO in a tough spot. In fact, before the summit was agreed, there was a healthy discussion of why have a summit? I mean, why give an unpredictable, disruptive US president a platform to disrupt the alliance? Just hunker down, strap on the Kevlar, and do NATO's business from inside. But of course, now we're going to have a summit. And we'll see.
But I mean, the point. One of the points you made is there may be a virtue in simplicity, and there is an upside particularly if you get this president to be there for a communique that at least affirms the importance of NATO, which I have to imagine a one-page communique will, one way or another say that NATO's a good thing. Given that where he was, that's not so bad. I'm glad you made the point about the difference between how he's dealing with Iran at the moment. It can change at any second now, and Russia, because the truth is he has made threats towards the Russians. It's just he doesn't deliver on any of them, and he's threatened secondary sanctions and even I think implicitly more arms transfers. But he doesn't deliver. Now, part of this may be because the Iranians apparently did try to kill him, so which he may take personally, and whereas he has this kind of strange feeling about Putin that makes all of us uneasy. We've been moving right along. I was wondering if I could shift the topic a little bit to tap your experience as the Deputy National Security Advisor, so really running the machinery of government with regard to 2 wars, not one. And there are a lot of interesting questions I could ask you. But one thing that I was thinking about at this moment, the Trump administration is facing its first bona fide crisis. This is, we've opted to say we're standing back. We may not be able to stand back. An Iranian missile may hit an American ship, or, there are all kinds of possibilities here, which would one way or another get us much more directly involved than they originally intend. There's a lot of differing views in the administration. I think it is a commonplace, but I think it's probably the truth that they don't have much of an NSC process. I was wondering if you could describe from an insider's point of view, what does a good process look like and why does it matter?
In conventional terms, I suppose the National Security Council staff process, sort of hinges on the Brent Scowcroft model, right? Which is where the staff comes together. The National Security Council staff is the convening authority for a process that brings various bureaucratic perspectives, different views, different reads of the intelligence to the same table, right? Debates them, tries to learn as much as possible at the outset of the problem at hand, right? So it pools expertise and diversity of expertise from across the different departments and agencies, and then eventually crafts options leading to a decision by the president. And then equally important is that after the president makes a decision, so there's a decision memorandum, there's an initial decision sheet, or there's a speech to the nation that there's a new approach, a new foreign policy, national security approach. The National Security Council staff has a responsibility in the implementation phase to make sure that the bureaus and the departments and the agencies are actually doing what the president decided. I used to describe this as sort of 10% of the responsibility of the National Security Council staff is to staff the president. So every phone call, every visit, every trip, and so forth, right? So you sort of write in the preparatory memos and so forth. 20 or 25% staff the decision-making process, but the rest of the 100% really has to do with overseeing implementation. Now, not actually conducting implementation, so not conducting operations from the executive office building, but simply checking the signals and making sure that the strategy, which is the alignment of ends, ways, and means, stays aligned, and that we're actually moving towards the end. And very importantly, is alert to opportunities or requirements to adapt a strategy because conditions on the ground have changed. The enemy has a vote, weather, Clausewitz with friction and fog and so forth, all the things that Eliot has written so well about, right? All those intervene and try to knock a strategy out of alignment, right? So one of the things the National Security Council staff should do is to be constantly checking the alignment of ends, ways, and means. Now, here's the challenge when you disassemble the National Security Council staff, right? And you find yourself in a crisis situation, which I suspect is where we are today. And it's not clear to me that the National Security Council staff today is a place that is well set to assemble that kind of expertise, have a respectful conversation at the deputies level and then eventually the principals level that accepts diversity of views, differing opinions, a debate, right? Then eventually then takes it to the president. So I worry about that. I worry about the national security decision-making process being divorced from experts and being based more on sort of fly-by-night judgments and opinions. And by the way, this concern extends beyond the National Security Council staff. What about FEMA? I mean, so if there's a meteorological metaphor, we're entering hurricane season and we've disassembled FEMA. What about the CDC and the potential for a pandemic, right? So there's any number of federal capabilities that we've counted on in the past to be able to respond to crises of all sorts of variety that have taken major hits in the last 4 or 5 months. So the National Security Council staff is closest to this podcast, but we could have another one on FEMA and we could have another one on pandemics and so forth. And I think there's a heightened risk of mismanagement, ignorant decision making, and lousy execution that lays in front of us.
I vividly remember you describing your job, or at least a large part of it, as being the company first sergeant of the interagency. And what a company first sergeant is doing is making sure, okay, everybody's got full canteens and, they have all the equipment they're supposed to have and they are where they're supposed to be. And I think when people talk about the NSC and its processes, they usually think of it as, you're coming up with clever ideas, where the reality is, I think, as you just described it,
it's much more brute force. It's much more brute force than anything else.
And more often than not, it's not coming up with bright ideas. It's actually killing really bad ideas.
Well, sometimes that could be a bright idea.
Doug, there are a couple of other issues I hope we could get to here as we start to run down on time. One is, going back to Europe for a second, the question of U.S. reliability in Article 5. I mean, Article 5 has ultimately been guaranteed in Europe since 1949, when the treaty was ratified, by the U.S. undertaking to protect our allies with the full force of our nuclear arsenal if need be. And, that was added to over time by the British detonation of a nuclear weapon in 1952 and then the French 10 years later. But it's really been the U.S. arsenal. I mean, the French actually pulled out of the Unified Military Command in 1966. And then when they came back in 2008, they did not join the nuclear planning group. So, although there's always been a sort of presumption that French nuclear weapons in a crisis would be at the disposal of, or at least employed, in parallel with those of the alliance, they're not really part of the planning that NATO undertakes for nuclear deterrence in Europe. There is a question of whether Europeans at this point can rely on Donald Trump to make good on that. And there's been a lot of talk that, well, the French and the Brits are going to have to step up and provide, a nuclear deterrent in the absence of the U.S. deterrent. Now, I've been a big skeptic about that. Frank Miller and I had a piece not long ago in the Bulwark about why it was unlikely that the U.S. Nuclear deterrent could be substituted for the French deterrent. I'm sorry, the British and French could substitute for the U.S. deterrent for a variety of reasons. Where do you think that debate and discussion is going in Europe, and how do you come out on it?
Well, you're right, Eric. I think, the ultimate Article 5 guarantee has always been the U.S. nuclear backstop, right? And even if you add together the French and the British nuclear capability, you're still at about 10% of what the Russians have, right? So if you tried to craft a new nuclear deterrence equation based on the French and the British balancing the Russians, it's almost an impossible imbalance, and so I think that's a challenge. This has come to my mind recently when we've heard talks about the potential to remove American conventional forces, ground forces, from Europe, right, as part of the rebalancing towards European capabilities and as part of the shift to Asia and all that, right? And one of the key roles of American ground forces in Europe, and both the rotational forces, which have been there now for over 3 years as a result of the invasion of Ukraine on the eastern flank, but also those permanently based in Europe, right? The conventional forces have served the function of connecting the on the ground situation ultimately all the way back to the strategic deterrent, right? And that, the effort, the multi-decades extension of American deterrence, American nuclear deterrence to European allies has been cemented. It's been demonstrated. It's been made real by way of the presence of those conventional forces. So what I worry about is by some sort of perhaps well-intentioned attempt to rebalance conventional capabilities in Europe, we actually end up breaking extended deterrence because we remove those forces that actually provide the most clear link to the American nuclear backstop. And I think this is a major issue.
So let me ask a follow-on question really to both of you. I completely agree. The ideal thing would be, we keep something like the force structure we have now and the nuclear guarantee is strong. But if, as you say, this is not going to go back to where it was and or could even get worse depending on the vagaries of Donald Trump and his possible successors, wouldn't it make sense for more European countries to acquire nuclear weapons?
This has a overlay on the crisis in the Middle East today as well, right? Because the conventional wisdom and the longstanding premise has been that proliferation is bad, right, and ultimately destabilizing, because the addition of nuclear powers causes others to counteract by way of further proliferation, and it's a bit of a spiral effect. And certainly, we see this playing out prominently with regard to Iran these days. But I think it probably plays out across Europe as well. The challenge, I think, is that in the short term, you can only turn, as Eric's initial question did, to the existing nuclear powers, so the UK and France. And candidly, their nuclear capabilities are simply do not balance the over 4,000 nuclear weapons of Russia. And potentially, especially don't balance the 4,000 nuclear weapons in Russia if Russia's conventional capability is much diminished as a result of what they've lost in Ukraine, right? So if Russia is left, however the Ukraine war winds down, with a depleted conventional capability, it inevitably will have to rely on the other two ends of the spectrum, right? Nuclear and hybrid, right? So in a world where Russia relies more on nuclear threats and that sort of thing, as we've seen already play out to some positive effect for Russia in the Ukraine war, I don't think that the sort of 1/10 the size UK and French capabilities would be much of an effective deterrent or balance against Russia's 4,300 or whatever they have nuclear weapons. So there's no good answer here, and I think to go back to our earlier conversation, if it's true that the West is splintering into the U.S. as a pole and Europe as a pole, this is a key question that Europe as a pole, as an aspiring pole, will have to take on. Can it sufficiently still have confidence in the U.S. nuclear deterrent, or does it have to create one itself? And given the political diversity, the political fragmentation of Europe, I don't think that's an issue that's likely to be resolved anytime soon. So this is a real conundrum, and I think you're right to highlight it.
So, Doug, one last question. We're meeting here in the aftermath of a couple of events. The president's parade on Saturday, which was to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States Army, an institution to which you devoted your entire professional life, and a speech at Fort Bragg earlier in the week that was highly politicized, in which he essentially solicited the soldiers who apparently, according to reporting from military.com, were hand-selected, both for appearance and for their political views. All of this, for those of us who worry about civil-military relations, and I look back with fondness on the days when you were the director for operations of the Joint Staff, and I was the Undersecretary of Defense Policy, and we were right at that seam of civil-military relations. I am terribly worried about, eroding the professionalism of the U.S. military and turning it into like a politicized institution. And I just wonder if you share those worries and how those events struck you.
Well, they're disturbing events, Eric, and you missed one that I count as equally significant, and that's the commencement address at West Point a couple weeks before the two that you cite, right? All to include the president wearing his MAGA campaign hat throughout the ceremony. The Fort Bragg thing is interesting because, there's actually a Department of Defense regulation, a policy that prohibits service members in uniform in participating in partisan events. So you can't go to political rallies, for example. You can't go to the, national political or campaign convention and, so forth, right? Those all obviously make sense. But the problem with the Fort Bragg example is what happens when the rally comes to the troops, right? Which is exactly what happened at Fort Bragg. I mean, they didn't sign up to attend a rally, but the president brought them a rally. And I think that's a huge problem. When I talk to general officer courses here in Washington at National Defense University and so forth, right? We talk a little bit about being apolitical versus nonpartisan. And I remind them that, just serving as a flag officer in the U.S. military, you are a political actor. I mean, you can't go to a deputies committee meeting or a principals committee and not be political. You can't launch a U.S. Army budget in the budget process without being immersed in a political process. So it's not politicization that's the hazard. It's partisanizing, making partisan. Making partisan the problem. And this administration, but not solely this administration, I would mention. This is not a brand new Donald Trump phenomenon. This goes back several decades where presidential candidates have solicited and received endorsements of uniformed military officers. And it's been a slow, steady erosion of staying out of partisan politics, that I think that process has been accelerated. The erosion has been accelerated under this president, and it's a significant concern. And frankly, I think it's the first significant test of the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who himself is to some extent a product of partisan decisions to relieve his predecessor and bring him out of retirement, make him chairman. Okay, he's chairman. Okay, now what, Ranger? As we used to say in the military to those wearing the Ranger tab. Now what? What's your course of action? And I think that General Kane has an important responsibility and an important opportunity right now in the face of this sort of pattern of events that we've seen to make his mark. And I'm waiting for him to do so.
Thank you, Doug.